Welcome to another episode of the Scottish Property Podcast. My name's Nick Ponte. I'm back with Stephen Clark. How you doing?
How are you, Nick?
Oh, good. Thanks very much. You ditched me last week, and I'm glad to see you back. So, yeah.
Oh, I know. I am gutted I missed the chat with John Blackwood. I'm sure it would have been interesting, but I probably would have been the mute in that conversation, as it's not my area of expertise. So I'm glad I just left yourself and John to get on with that chat.
Well, don't worry. We've got an even more thrilling subject for you today. It's evictions and rent arrears, and we've managed to get a specialist on this subject. His name's Jeff Livingstone.
Yeah, so Jeff Livingstone's from Landlord Specialist Scotland Services, and his company specialises in basically acting on behalf of the landlord to evict a tenant. And do you know what? It was actually a really good chat. He was very knowledgeable on it. It's the type of person that I would completely enlist their services to go and get after it, because he knows his stuff, he's passionate about it, and that's what he does. So he breaks it in a good detail, doesn't he?
Yeah, you know me, I could talk about this stuff all day long, which is why I line up these guests for the listeners. And I think it's a really hot topic at the moment. There'll be a lot of worry about landlords at the moment coming into this period where obviously the Scottish government have just introduced their emergency protections for tenants bill, where, the eviction ban, and it's something that landlords will be worried about as their costs increase through their rising interest rates as well. So you really need to know, how do you actually get a non-paying tenant out? So this is what we dive into, and we go through the step-by-step process, the timescales involved, the costs involved. And,
I think that was important as well, to go over the US and details on the timescales, the costing, so you get a full picture of it, because a lot of landlords, myself included, I'm kind of guilty of just waiving arrears as long as you get them out, waive it and go on. But Jeff goes into details exactly what the costs are involved and the time frames, and it kind of puts your mind at ease and realizes it isn't as bad as you would expect, and he does break it down and explain it to a point where it feels that it isn't as it's too
manageable
to actually go through. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, we'll just cut straight to the interview with Jeff Livingstone. Hope you enjoy. So I'm delighted to welcome to the Scottish Property Podcast Jeff Livingstone from Landlord Specialist Scotland
Services
Scotland. Sorry about that, Jeff.
That's a mouthful.
We'll keep this right. And you have come recommended through our Facebook group because there's been a few posts recently about, tenant arrears, evictions, which I think is really going to be a hot topic for landlords coming into this winter with the cost of living crisis. So we thought we'd do a wee episode with you and a bit of content to try and help landlords, letting agents really understand the whole process around evictions, specifically tailored to the grounds for rent arrears. So that's what we're going to concentrate on today. But a very warm welcome to the show today, Jeff. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks, and thanks for inviting me along. Much appreciated.
Excellent. So just tell us a little bit about how you got into this business in the first place, then. Just a little bit of background about yourself.
Background, well, after being in the military for 3 years, come back into civilian life and went into working in social housing. And from there, discovered that I was very good at negotiating with tenants. I worked in the rent arrears team with large city council. So I was there for 6 years, something like that. Ended up in the court team, presenting arrears cases and such like at court, and then worked for various local authorities and housing associations over the years. So coming with 17 years experience in social housing and private rented sector, one of my main parts of my work was to scrutinise notices that tenants were coming in with that had been served by landlords and such like, and to return the notices with invalid or such like. But yeah, that's how I've sort of come into this realm.
So now what you do is, just explain what you do. You help landlords and letting agents with the...
Absolutely. The bridge between the landlord and the solicitor, I would say, because one of the things I did notice over the years of doing this was the amount of times that landlords were making errors, and they were simple errors. And so I looked at that and said, well, once I moved from this, I can see an opportunity here. So the company was set up in the ethos of helping landlords at reasonable pricing and fixed pricing and such like. So we basically will do anything that is a breach of the tenancy agreement, or if the landlord's just wishing to sell on vacant possession under the old short assured tenancies, we will create the documents, the notices and everything else to serve on the tenant, so they can then take them to the local authority if required, and then the local authority can process an application with threatened with homeless or a full-blown homeless application. But it helps the landlord, it prevents him from, you know, the delays in the process, the frustration, and taking it personally. Unfortunately, a lot of the smaller landlords, you know, do take a lot of stuff on board personally, and I get that, it's their property. But I'm there to alleviate that. I work as their agent. All communications would come directly to me from the tenant and such like. So take the stress away from them, but also keep them in the loop of what's progressing.
So let's just talk about it then. I mean, are you seeing any increase in, you know, people coming to you saying that their tenants are struggling, they're getting into arrears, or is this, do you think this is still really to take effect, this cost of living crisis, with it in terms of people not being able to pay their rent?
I would say that the wave hasn't been built up yet. There is elements of people panic buying, and what I mean by that is, you know, tenants are already sort of like looking and going, I can't afford to pay that shortfall if they're getting, say, part housing benefit or such like. I can't afford to pay that shortfall because my electricity bill will be this amount in a month's time. So they're already sort of mentally planning how they're going to diversify their income to pay other things, because where's people's priorities lie with debt is quite it's a stickler thing, because the house round you protects you, but they don't see that. They need the electricity for the telly and such like. So it's where they prioritise things. And a lot of landlords, you know, would, you know, as soon as the tenant starts to default in that, and as I say, they take it personally, and I advise them, please don't do that. It's a business. And, you know, I appreciate they're going to move into financial hardship because they're relying on that income to cover the mortgage to let, and the insurances on the building and things like that. Completely understand that, but you've got to have that little bit of separation, and that's where we slot into there to take that out of the equation for them. But in regards to where we're going to be in 6 months' time, well, that's another area, because the way things are going and the way the government's saying, you know, we're going to cap the fuel to 2,500, if I remember right. You know, that's actually the running cost of it, not the usage. If somebody uses more than that, then they're getting charged more than that, you know. So it's a bit of a mislead where people say, oh, well, I can have the electricity on all the time. Well, no, you can't. Please still try and control it, because it's not a case of that's the ceiling, that's all you can get charged. You will get charged a lot more, and you'll have a lot more debt to worry about. And that then subsequently will have that knock-on effect to the landlords and such like. And the landlords will be looking to raise action against the tenant, you know, in regards to that. And that's only evolved through fuel poverty.
From a tenant's point of view, Jeff, do you think that the tenants see this headlines, the fuel cap, and then they'll think like that? And then obviously Nicola Sturgeon's announcement on rent freezes or eviction bans, is that something else that they'll just think, well, they can't kick us out and they can't put a rent up? Is it, rather than you're still responsible to pay your rent on time, is it more of an education from your point of view, educate the tenant to?
Absolutely, and speak to them. You know, for all landlords to get on the phone to your tenants now and explain, you know, if you are going to hit any difficulty, speak to me, or, you know, speak to them directly first. Make the first move. Open that line of communication to prevent any major disasters happening. Although the SNP and the Green Party have voted through for the ban on the winter evictions and any rental increases, but there's also the fact where they haven't, you know, and I would advise landlords to always look at it as possibly a rent decrease for a small interim period, and then to add that, like what you do with a mortgage break. You know, you don't not get away with not paying for the last 6 months. They add it on to the back end, and landlords can do that. That's not a rental increase. You know, if you're looking to help out your tenant, you reduce the rent, and then once we go through this period and the economy starts to move up again, you can then add that on as an insert to the monthly rent is your rent plus the money outstanding for the rent break or the decrease in rent for 3 months. All these things are negotiable with tenants. And
how does that stand up with part of an arrears process? And if you kind of gift them this rent break or this rent decrease to help them through a period of time, if then you increase it and then put on their kind of rent break price back onto it, can they just serve their notice and then leave, and you've missed that? Is that then classed as part of their arrears? That
potentially, yes. That'd be money owing to you from rent lawfully due, and both parties. It wouldn't be a case of a verbal contract. You would be signing the documentation, so the landlord would be fully entitled to look at recovery action for that through first-tier tribunal. And that, once again, is a process that's separate from a rent arrears process, because if you go for a tribunal action on rent arrears for recovery of the property, that doesn't mean you're going to get the money back in any way. Once you've enforced a decree, that's it. The money's away, so to speak, unless you go for a recovery for payment order as well.
I like that kind of that idea of the kind of communication, and obviously trying to prevent something happening. And I feel like every time I've run into difficulty with a tenant, I've always spotted that be my communication breakdown with the tenant or the letting agent's communication. I think if that conversation was held up front, you probably would agree that you avoid getting into these situations in the first place.
Absolutely. Because the problem is when somebody goes into debt, particularly like with tenants and such, or anybody. In fact, I'm not going to categorise it. Anybody going into debt, it's not a single debt. There's multiple debts there, and that could be council tax, fuel, all different nursery fees, things like that. Small nursery fees and that. A lot of people, there's a hidden debt and such like that people don't actually, forecast for. Things happen, we can all know I'm going to have a birthday every year. Christmas is going to happen every year. But I couldn't predict what's going to happen next week in my life financially, and people need to prepare for that. And unfortunately, just due to the way the cost of living is, a lot of savings are getting used up. But certainly, as you say, is getting that line of communication started in the first instance to show I'm not a big ogre here. I am a genuine person, and I can understand.
Yeah, let's just be frank. No landlord wants to go down eviction proceedings. We don't want to do that. It's stressful.
Absolutely.
It's costly. It does make no sense. So yeah, it's not something that we enjoy doing. And this idea that we get some sort of satisfaction of evicting tenants, which sometimes is what's portrayed in the press and the media and amongst some tenant groups as well. That are quite...
Absolutely. I was just waiting. Don't forget the advice groups.
Yeah.
They portray the landlord as the evil person and such like, and likewise what you were saying there in regards to how the tenant understands with, the eviction ban and you can't put the rent up and such like, and how where their train of thought goes with that. And a lot of that time is I would call them as estate lawyers or advice centres say, oh, don't worry, I can't do anything to you. If you can't afford the rent, don't pay it. Pay these other debts first. These are your priority debts. Well, they're actually not your priority debt. The courts and the rules of court state that your rent is a priority debt over that mobile phone, the new Apple phone or whatever contract that you were intended to take out. So it's, and as I say, a lot of tenants would be, well, that advice person, she's on my side. You're just doing for your own equation here. So I'll listen to them more than I'm going to listen to you. And that's when communication breaks down, because you're standing there going, I'm trying to help you. And you're listening to a voice that has no, they go to their nice wee warm home at night. They're not you. This is risking your, security of tenure. And to get that over to them and get them understand, and as I say, that open communication with them is
what do you think then when tenants go to get advice like that, whether it be Shelter Scotland or some of these legal outfits or the council or whatever, a lot of the time you hear tenants saying, like I need to be made homeless to get a council house.
Yeah.
And to be made homeless, then, you know, I'm going to fall into rent arrears, or I'm just not going to pay my rent. You know, is this something that happens quite a lot?
Yes, absolutely. And you will see it if you, there's a good wee bit of research as to go into first year tribunal hearing outcomes, and you will see a lot of the time in the hearing documentation that the tenants have expressed that they're not opposing any action to recover the property because the council have told them that they need to get that decree or the eviction before they'll get rehoused. And that, to me, is a waste of time, the court's time, the tribunal's time and everything. You know, the local authorities now, what we used to have years ago was a non-fault ground. If you were on a short assured and it was a vacant possession, there was no tacit relocation in the tenancy agreement, such like. It was a straightforward case. There was a non-fault ground. There was no intentionality or anything like that. Local connections there, everything. So it was a rubber stamp job. But now the local authorities have jumped on reasonableness, where previously all cases were looked on mandatory and discretionary for the grounds and such like. So now tribunal is enforcing the reasonableness. Is it reasonable that this person loses the property? Well, if they're not paying the rent and they have no intentions of paying that rent, then it is reasonable that they lose it. But the local authorities are now going, well, you're neither threatened with homeless or homeless at this moment in time until there's an order against you and there's findings from tribunal. And literally, they're all coming back going, well, the council said they'll not do anything until you've got a court order. And they'll just sit there waiting on that.
There's a flawed bit in the system, because I've got a rent arrears case where I think it's about $4.5 the arrears, and then, you know, they gave them the eviction notice. They were meant to move out in December last year, and I didn't want to kick them out a week or so before Christmas, so allow it to go. They started paying rent again, a bit, you know, 20 quid short of her, so there was rental income coming in. It was one of the ones where you just like, okay, we'll work with you to try and resolve the situation. Now, the resolution they come to was, well, we can't get on the council list unless you give us a reference to say we're a good tenant and say we're homeless. So the eviction stands, they're leaving, but because of the shortage in social housing stock, they're still there waiting and not, well, and paying the debt, but not paying the rent arrears of $4.5, and that's what they're wanting. Well, you waive that, and we'll just go and get a council house. So that technically, I mean, yes, I could go during the first tier tribunal, which is going to be a pain in the arse and take a long time. And if they are in such financial hardship, when am I going to get that money back, if I ever will? And it's like the council's wanting you to go down that route just to get them out because they're not giving them a house yet.
Yeah,
this has been since last December.
Yeah, the what I would say, if you have a tenant that is, you know, can pay and won't pay, obviously you would look at raising that action. But if you've got a tenant who's in a situation where they're unfortunately, due to the hardship that's possibly going to be sort of paramount soon, is to look at the recovery action for the rent arrears without actually going through the process of the eviction. Because, as you say, if they're managing to maintain the rent but they're not paying the arrears, then your safeguard is to get the recovery action. So if they do move on later in the day, you've still got that recovery action that will follow them. That decree is on their credit referencing and such like.
You deal with that as well, recovering.
Yeah,
debt.
Absolutely. Yeah. The
what's the I've always wondered that, because a lot of people just kind of write it off, don't they? And they just say this is not worth time. You know, if they've got no money anyway, what's the chances of getting it back? So what would, you know, what are the chances of getting the money back?
Well, this goes back to, you can't predict the future. So you can't say, oh, he's no money today, but next week he might win the lottery.
Yeah.
So he has got money next week or next year or whatever. He gets a really good job, he gets qualified, he gets his HND or whatever, and he moves into a really good job. Once you've got the recovery action decree, then that's with you, and that doesn't go away until it's satisfied. There is the terminology, you know, within Scotland, it's written off within 5 years and such like. That's only if you haven't got a court order.
So you really need that. You need that order. So that's the payment order from the first tier tribunal.
If I owed you money, say I bought a car and only paid you half it, you would have 5 years to take me to court for small claims. After the 5-year period, if you do not have a court order, then it becomes, in Scotland, referred to as a prescribed debt, and it's non-enforceable, and such like with various other debts as well. But if you have the court order, then that stays there until that's satisfied. So if that person was to, say, 8 years, 10 years time, buy a house, you know, their life changes, they buy a house, you hear about that, you go, right, I know where he stays. You then go to sheriff officers and say, here's my order. I want that pinned against the property, and then an attachment order would go on that property, and he could not, the attachment order would mean that the debt has to be satisfied before they could sell that property and such. Right. So there's all different ways of doing things.
It sounds like it's worth it then. Because,
it's not a quick way. You're absolutely right. If you've got tenants who have not, they're in that poverty area at that moment in time, don't assume they're always going to be there. You know, or they may have that wee static caravan that nobody told you about. You know, but one thing I would say with anybody, letting agents are fairly good at it, but the smaller landlords, get as much information on that tenant as possible. Take photographs of their passport, their driving license and everything. I've got clients that come to me, and I've got one at the moment, it doesn't even know the name of the tenant. There's no tenancy agreement.
And what are the chances of trying to, because obviously if you go to sheriff officers, then they're going to need to try and track them down.
What's his name? John Smith. Okay, right. We'll start with that.
That's a good tip. So let's just roll back a wee bit then, and just to try and really focus down on giving landlords some help here in terms of, if you know they're self-managing, or even if they've got a rubbish letting agent that doesn't know what they're doing, you know what I mean, and they have to kind of step in. There's kind of, for me, because I'm a letting agent myself, right? Yeah. So I'm dealing with this stuff at the moment. But you know, there is quite often the case the rent won't come in on the due date, and quite often it's just a case of picking up the phone, speaking to the tenant. Oh, sorry, I didn't realise there's been a mistake. I forgot. Or there's been an issue with the bank account or something. And usually I would say 9 times out of 10, it's resolved within a matter of a couple of days, right? Now, obviously, you're not getting involved at that point. What happens if obviously it goes, you know, on and on and on, you're getting excuses, or you have no communication at all, then obviously people are thinking at that point they might want to contact you. So what would but if they didn't contact you, what I'm saying is, what steps would they take, or what steps would you take actually?
Well, what I would say is, don't go down or try to avoid the texting and going round to the house unannounced and such like. Is what you've got to watch here is, when somebody goes into debt, they also become under the protection of Acts of Parliament, which is the Debtors Act, the Debtors Scotland Act, and the harassment of debtors. So they come under the wee protected bubble. Doesn't protect them from the debt. What it does do is protect them from over communication and harassment, or what could be perceived as harassment. There's this old scenario, as I like to refer to it as, in the workplace. Oh, I feel as though you're bullying me. Well, that's not what I intended to do. It's not what you intended to do. It's how somebody feels what's happening to them is where you could be accused of that. And that then puts you in the realms of possibly police involvement and such like. So what I would say to everybody is, go back to the old-fashioned way. Emails at reasonable times. Don't do it 10 o'clock at night after a bottle of Lambrini and going, you owe me money. Please do not do that.
So you try to remove the emotion. I think that is so important, because we do have, just recently I've dealt with a landlord, and understandably, I can understand, I'm a landlord myself. It is difficult because you're like, they've got bills, you know, we've got bills, we've got costs, mortgages are not getting paid, and it's so easy just to explode. So that's a really crucial point there, just to kind of try and tame down the emotions.
Take a note, take the Lambrini out and the email at 10 o'clock at night.
Yeah, absolutely. Avoid texts as well. As I'd say, try to go back to the old-fashioned way of writing a letter, because uppercases and such like all perceive. It's a receiver who perceives what you're doing, and that's the first thing that can cut off communication between landlords and tenants, is how they perceive that email. Short bursts and such like are classed quite aggressively.
Yeah.
And we've all had emails and you've read it and you've gone, you cheeky little, and then you read it again and went, right, I see where the context is now. So somebody who's in debt, stroke multiple debt, and then getting that, and they are going to go, I don't know what to do, then they run into the, and quite rightly so, to get proper advice. But sometimes that advice isn't the best advice, and I'm not saying this is throughout, but sometimes a lot of advisors are fairly undertrained and not up to date with recent legislative changes and such like, and the information that they give isn't actually accurate and can be quite misleading at a later point for the tenant and put the tenant in a worse situation. But also the same side, as the tenant sees the landlord as somebody just wants their money and they'll tell them anything to get the money. And that's where, once again, we sit in the middle.
Yeah. And what are you saying in these emails, and how many emails are you putting out over what period of time?
Right. Well, don't send emails. We only do letters. So all letters are in line with the Debtors Act and such like. So it's a reasonable amount of letters. So one a week to start with. Then, just to remind them that they're in debt, they send a rent statement with that. Make sure you send a rent statement. Just don't send somebody a letter saying you owe me this amount, because you could be, they know who you are, but what I mean is, they're looking at it going, how? Show them how it's there. Let them understand that. So if they do go to an advice agency or whatnot, they've got the information there. They're not just sitting on a one-sided hearing from the tenant. They're looking at what information's coming from you, so they can see both sides, and then they'll be able to give that tenant more accurate advice or progress to good debt advice and such like. Go with letters, offer repayment, often, sit down and let's look at what your financials are and how we can assist you. Is all the actions that you're doing there are good actions and reasonable actions. It's not unreasonable for a landlord to look at doing that with a tenant or several tenants, but it also helps if at the end of the day the communication breaks down or it's not going to resolve themselves. And as you say, you're going to have to end up taking back the tenancy because it's never going to resolve themselves. And we're not going to prolong this. Void losses, or loss of rental income is no good to anybody.
So at this point, it's probably worth noting to people as well that we need to conform to the pre-action requirements, don't we?
That's great. Yeah, I was just going to move in. That all forms part of the due diligence under the pre-action requirements. And if you've evidence that you've tried everything that you can do, which is reasonable, and that's the other side of things is, where somebody said, oh, well, you could look at reducing the rent. Yeah, but with their finances, I would have to reduce it £150, which would mean that you would have to pay £85 on top to sustain the mortgage. Well, that's not reasonable because that's your money. And, if you're a single landlord, well, that's you've got to now find that money to top that up. So it's working out where the levels are. As I say, that if you do a rent decrease, reduce the rent for a few months and then add it on, make sure that's all documented, not through text or anything like that. Everything needs to get documented. And if you're going into agreements, sign the agreements off so both parties know where they are. Don't go around with an agreement that day and get it signed that day. Send it over to them, allow them to go and seek other advice, give them a list of advice agencies, and then agree to meet a week later to sign that off.
Great. So in an ideal world, we're getting the tenant onto a repayment plan, or we're engaging, we're getting the communication going, and we're getting the money coming in. What happens if that fails? At what point can we then proceed to the next stage? If we've done all the attempts to obviously engage with the tenant, set up the payment plan, that fails, what's the time scale and what do we do next?
Right. So if there's no money coming in and you need to then look at raising that action through first year tribunal, then once you've completed all the paperwork or the submission form, submitted all the evidence, tenancy agreement, repayment schedules, copies
Yeah,
of.
but sorry, how many months do they need? People need to know how many months they
right,
need.
yes. So from the rent arrears side of things, it needs to be 3 clear months. So if somebody didn't pay January, didn't pay February, you couldn't raise that action at the end of March, February, March, because that's not into a clear month. Once it's hit the clear month into the April period, then you would start the process from there. Once you've got that period of time, then you're submitting all your paperwork into tribunal. On an average, it takes about 12 weeks before you're going to get notified of a case management date. And case management dates are a pre-hearing. And sometimes, if all going well, everything could be dealt with on that date. It's not always a guarantee. It could go to full hearing.
Sorry, Jeff, sorry to stop you again. I keep butting in here, but I just want to make sure I've got this right? Because so after the 3 months, now they can be in some amount of arrears. It doesn't need to be the full 3 months. They can be in some amount of arrears, my understanding. So you can then serve the notice to quit, right? As the landlord, you don't need to go straight to the. You don't need to go straight to the.
No, sorry. Yes, yeah. You don't need to go straight to tribunal. You need to do your notice to quit, and depending on what type of tenancy agreement they're on, because we've still got some old short assured and some tenancy agreements which were started then aren't actually short assured and have defaulted to assured.
Yeah.
So you need
Let's
to
just keep it to PRT, because most people are in PRTs now, but you're absolutely right. So the PRT, so the PRT would be for rent arrears now, I think it's 28 days. 28 days.
Well, let's go with legislative changes can happen at any time. So the once you've done your notice in line with the time period of that period, whether it be the 28 days, whatever, then you would then complete your paperwork for first tier tribunal. Now, all that documentation is available on tribunal websites to submit over. Put as much evidence as possible. The more information you've got in your submission, the better for the first tier clerks to then progress that in a timely manner over to the legal member to consider and then issue a case management date on top of that.
Okay. Is there any cost to that, going to the first tier tribunal?
Not if you're doing it as an independent, no.
Obviously, if you're
using an agent like myself or a solicitor, yes, there is.
Sorry to interrupt this podcast, but just wanted to let you know about the Scottish Property Podcast Christmas Ball, which is happening at the Village Hotel in Glasgow on Saturday the 3rd of December.
Can't wait. Myself and Stephen thought it'd be a great idea to have an end of year party like no other party to celebrate building this amazing community. There's going to be a whole range of people there to network with from the great and good of the Scottish Property Network. Whether you are single, bring your partner along, or if you're an office party, make it a work night out.
Early bird tickets are available on our website for £95, which include a welcome drink, 3-course dinner, live music, and a DJ up until 1 o'clock in the morning to allow us to party on. Hope to see you guys there.
And so just if they get 28 days notice, you obviously need to wait till that notice expires and then you're applying to first tier tribunal. I suppose it's important to say that the tenant could leave within that 28 days. They might get that notice to quit and they might say, right, okay, I don't want this hassle anymore. I just want to leave. So obviously you would need to, it's hard when there's no communication there at all. So I guess you need to kind of do checks at the end of the 28 days to see if they've left. So
what I would say there is, if you suspect a tenant has left, but you have no confirmation of it, is to progress as you would. And also then to possibly raise a joint action for abandonment of the tenancy to formally end it. The problem that a lot of landlords would have is, they went away, I've taken back, I've changed the locks or whatever. It's not to say that that tenant's not in hospital.
Yeah.
It's not to say that tenant's not been, remanded in custody, where they're still, if they were on benefits, they're still entitled to a benefit payment to maintain the rent account and such like. So for a private landlord, it's quite hard to find out where the tenants went. And that's why I always say, setting up a tenancy, or if they've got a guarantor, happy days. If not, get their next of kin details. So if they do disappear, you can phone them.
Somebody else.
And what I would also say is, please, 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 don't take the details at that moment in time. They're correct. In a year's time, that could change. So renew that. Always renew it when you're reviewing the tenancy agreement and such like, or you're out to replace something. You go, you know what? I'll take the update contact details back out, and we'll just make sure everything's up to date, because people change their phone numbers, email addresses change every second day with a lot of people. So just maintain that good housekeeping. So if anything does happen, you can show, if you're going for an abandonment, that you've everything at your resources has been tried to contact this tenant and it's failed. So therefore, you would never be liable for any illegal evictions. And that's one road you didn't want to go down.
These are good nuggets, Jeff. These are great. So these are good tips for people. So you've got the case manager, you've got the case management officer, and it's gone to tribunal. You're waiting, things are going through. You might get a few emails back and forth asking you to submit, tenancy agreements. All the rest.
Then, Nick, have you?
A few times, yeah, in the last couple. Yeah. I mean, it's quite a, I've got to say, I found it quite a slow process.
It is.
The other thing is you've mentioned this in the past as well. You try and phone them up and, they'll just give you, what's the line they give you when you try and ask them for a wee bit of help?
Basically, it's a straightforward, but we're not allowed to give any legal advice. You need to seek your own legal advice. And they're quite right in that, because, as I say, when somebody may interpret something somebody says to them, go, well, that must be factual, and then that could be used against that person. DWP have a wonderful saying within their reorganisation. It's not one that's broadcast, but internally, basically new starts are told it's not your job to inform, it's their job to be informed. Yeah,
which is fair enough. I mean, you can understand that, I guess.
Because if you say to somebody they're getting £60 a week, they only get £50 a week, they're coming back with a big hammer.
Yeah. So you get your date, your hearing date. So this is where, I mean, you just a quick couple of minutes on that. Obviously, the tenant gets a chance to represent, and the landlord as well. Like you say, you could represent on behalf of the landlords.
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah.
And generally, all landlords that I deal with go to tribunal request that service. They not that they just can't be bothered with it or anything like that. It's, once again, it's taking them into an area that they're unsure of in regards to it, and they may not feel confident in being challenged and such like. They feel as though they may be challenged. It's because it's coming through a court process. It's suddenly, oh God, I'll have to be called into the dock and whatnot. And that's not what the whole situation is. It's just you put over your side, the legal member and the non-legal member would ask questions if there is questions arise, and listen to both sides of the situation, and then hopefully be able to make a ruling from that point. If not, it would then go into a full hearing, and they can sometimes take a full day.
Yeah, and they do try, and I mean, you are up against, basically you're up against a solicitor, aren't you? Like, the legal members are practicing legal, like lawyers, solicitors.
I believe so. They're although they're only classed as a legal member, I would say that yes. I couldn't say exactly what all the qualifications are. But yes.
I mean, the last one that I did that was on just a phone call. Is that the same as you? You're not going into tribunal, are you? To actually sit.
No, the very few and far between the sitting ones now. I think and COVID improved that. It's managed to get a few more through the door than what was taken before, when you had to either attend Glasgow or where it in George Street and such like, in Edinburgh and such like. But yeah, it has helped to take the process up a wee notch. But as you say, it is quite a long and slow process from point of submission to getting case management dates and such like. And I always advise clients is, that, you know, there's no quick fix here. It will take as long as it takes, because once you put your paperwork in, it needs to be checked, verified, everything else, and then submissions need to be made to, summons need to be served on the tenant, and they're then given their time to reply back. So they're given time to go and speak to an advice agency or whatever, because whatever you submit, they get a copy of, and it's within the first year tribunal paperwork and such like. If you're submitting bank statements to show that they're not paying any money in, please redact all personal information, because they will receive a copy of everything that you submit. And likewise, as I say, excuse me.
Sorry. Your dog's not a fan of the first tier tribunal.
Sorry about that. That's the dog water just about to turn up, I think. Oh no, it's postman.
Oh, is it? Do you need to go? We can.
No, absolutely fine. No. So yeah, just make sure that when you're submitting stuff, you're not also making personal comments or anything like that. Please just try not to do that. But yeah, so once that all goes in there, as you say, everything will be sent to the tenant or the tenants, depending on the joint tenants as well. And that's the other aspect to remember here, the joint several liabilities on tenants, because what happens quite often is one tenant doesn't tell the other tenant that they're not paying the rent. And that can be a bit of a sticky one. So when I'm sending letters, I always send them individually. I don't send them as a joint. It's one to tenant one and one to tenant two.
Yeah.
If tenant one hides tenant two's letter, that's them interfering with the mail. But we have done what we need to do because both parties need to be informed. If you send it out as just a single letter with joint names, then...
Right. So we're getting near the end. So we're at the hearing. Hopefully we get the eviction order. What do we do now if we get the order? There's the appeal, isn't there?
There is 28 days from the date of order, 28 days to appeal that.
The tenant can appeal.
The tenant can appeal. But the tenant can only appeal, and it's clearly stated in the First Tier Tribunal website, that they can only appeal on a legal matter, point of law. The fact where they disagree with the tribunal because they're going to pay the rent in 6 months' time wouldn't be a point of law, and it would be rejected as an appeal. What you could also have is, and we go back to the joint tenant situation here, is a joint tenant pops up who might have been working away and didn't know about what was going on. They can then submit an appeal in and recall the case, and then possibly offer a repayment arrangement and such like. So it's that's why. Like,
the ones that I've done, so they've gone. Sorry to keep interrupting here. I'm just trying to rattle through the process because it's quite a long process. But the ones that I've done, generally the tenant doesn't show up, doesn't turn up. And then you think, well, they're getting an appeal. They're hardly going to appeal, you know. But I know they've got to go through the process and all that. But you're like, what's the point in waiting? You've got to wait another month. What?
Yeah.
For an appeal, they didn't even show up at the hearing. Another
month and 2 weeks. So once you get the decrease sent out to you, then you would look to engage sheriff officers. You know, sheriff officers are the only ones that can serve the decree stroke charge for removing. And on the day of service, they would also, well, the charge of removing would have a date of removal. So they'd be asked to leave within 14 days. If they haven't removed themselves within 14 days, then an ejection would take place 14 days thereafter. If you agree to that, or you may say to them, no, I'm not going to be able to do that. So we'll delay that, move that over another week before the ejection takes place. But it clearly stated on the decree, the charge, the order from tribunal, when and where the date starts from.
Yeah. So from absolutely the point where the tenant fails to pay rent and say they just don't pay anything and there's no communication, this is the absolute worst case scenario. So I think this is important for landlords to realise the risks, because this can happen. It's pretty rare, to be honest with you. I've got to say, most of your tenancies will go fine and the tenants will be great. But I think it's really important to make people aware, from the point in time where the tenant stops paying rent to the point in time where the sheriff officers can go in and remove the tenant, what could you be talking about? How many months roughly?
I would say on an average, you're looking between, I'd say 8 and 9 months, all in.
I would say we had one recently, and it's been 10 months, but again, you're roughly around about that. I would say 9.
Providing there's no appeal, there's no delay between, say, a case management and a hearing, and that's the other one. If it gets dealt with case management, happy days, it'll be a lot quicker. If it goes to a full hearing, then it'll be another month before, or a month plus before a full hearing, because all parties need to, and any witnesses that are getting called and such like, all need to agree to that date. So that can extend that, as you say there, 10 months or whatever, if there was witnesses getting called. And both sides can call witnesses in a full hearing, but the witnesses wouldn't be required to attend that case management.
Jeff, so for this full process, what's the cost of it to the landlord? I mean, obviously, if the tenant's not paying their rent, they're building up more arrears, but what's the additional cost to the landlord for going through the first tier tribunal, and then obviously rough for services like yourself or someone to deal with it on their behalf as well?
Oh, on an average, if everything is straightforward and the tenancy agreement's in place, there's no complications and such like, for my services, through taking it from the initial notice period and bringing it right through to a case management attendance, is you're looking at about 420 all in. I can't say what other organisations charge.
Yeah, and is this something that could get added to the claim that you're claiming against? Because the cost associated with
no.
Process.
Within first tier tribunal rules, you can't claim expenses for engaging services. The only way you'll be able to claim an expense is for expenses that have been incurred due to the tenant's action.
Right.
So if the tenant was deliberately, not turning up for pre-arranged appointments and such like, you could look at the sort of actions. But for the raising the case and engaging an agent or a solicitor or whatever, you wouldn't be able to recover the costs.
I think that's a good point to highlight, the kind of cost of it, because somebody else might be in a few grand arrears and go, it's not worth the hassle. But for to engage with someone like you to do it on our behalf, and then, like you say, it's now enforceable for forevermore. Once it's agreed, it's probably a worthwhile action. And I'm assuming that, well, you could offset that cost against the limited companies if we're investing in limited companies on our own tax efficiencies, our own tax. So, and
likewise with through your limited company, or even the tax situation with the individual landlords these days and such like. Yeah, as long as you've got a good rent account and shown where the statements and such like, and you submit that as part of your return, then yes, there's a profit and loss. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and it's not only like the cost. You've got to think for your mental health as well. I think that is the other cost, because this can be incredibly stressful times for a landlord, especially if you've only got 1 or 2 properties. For me, I've had one recently, but I've got a portfolio, so I'm in a lucky situation where I can absorb that cost. So I'm not getting too stressed about it. But if, like we said, if your mortgage payments are going up at the moment with interest rate rises and you've got absolutely no income coming in.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's also, you'd say, the small landlords and such like, is to look at that insurance to cover you for any rent loss and such like. But once again, you need to make sure that your books are all correct. You can't just phone up the insurance company and say, "Oh, John's no paying the rent this month."
This would be the rent guarantee insurance.
Yes. Yeah. Some of the letting agents would provide that as part of their service and such like. But there's also the fact that they have to be in so much rent arrears. Now, I think it's a standard sort of 3 months before you can make a claim on that. But there's also the fact that you can apply, if you have the details of your tenant, then you may be able to apply for arrears direct through universal credit and such like, to bring up the direct payments and such like. But once again, that all depends on what information you're holding on the tenant and such like. And it's vitally important. And as you say, the stress it put on the landlord. Let's not forget the spouses here or the partners and such like, because a lot of the times I'm speaking to landlords and they're like, my wife has just gone absolutely crazy, or my partner's gone mental over this. And
you said this property game would give us a better holiday every year.
What do you mean the Lamborghini's gone away because we're not getting rent? We're selling the private number plate. No one know. Not all these. No, I'm only joking.
Yeah, we're having a.
It is true though. The external forces around it.
Absolutely,
it's more the landlords maybe been through a bit of shit over the years that they can kind of deal with and take on the chin, whereas it's your wife or your partner, your mum, and what's happening with that? Who she got their son, and just that.
And that's the thing.
They should be paying. You know,
and once again, you go back to this time scale. Why is that no fixed? Because it's going through the court process, and the courts, regardless of what the situation, whether it be a criminal court, civil actions, summary cause, whatever, are all slow. There's no quick fix, and nobody can rush it through. It will go through at the pace that the courts will process it, because diligence has to be done. People have to get a chance to respond and things like that. But certainly, the one big factor here is the knock-on effect to other people involved in the relationships and such. Like, you know, as you say, a lot of landlords are taking the chin and go, oh, we're doing that. But the pressure coming in for the other side is quite immense on them.
Let's just talk about last couple of minutes here, the latest government changes. So, you know, Nicola Sturgeon stepped up on the 6th of September and said that they were taking this emergency action. I believe the bill has just been published this week with the finer details. But in terms of evictions, you know, obviously the headline was eviction bans until the end of March 2023. So how's it looking like now? Can you just tell our listeners what they can do? At what point can they still proceed with the action?
At any point, from the rent arrears side of things, or any action, if the landlord's intending to sell the property, it needs renovated or whatever, still carry on. The whole process, first year tribunal doors are still open. All applications will still proceed. It just means when you get to the point of the decree, if the decree is prior to the end date, 31st of March, you won't get it until after the 31st of March. And that will also create a little snowball effect for various organisations to enforce your decrees and such like. But yeah, everything just goes ahead as normal. And as I described it earlier on there, it's like buying your Christmas presents and wrapping them in February. You can't open them until December. Yeah,
and I haven't really looked into the bill that much because I think it just came out yesterday, and we're recording this on Tuesday. What date are we today? Just so that people know, that's the 4th of October. I think it came out the 3rd. So I think there was a bit in there because people were worried about, you know, what if I need to sell the property? Like I'm in financial hardship. So I think you are allowed to do that now. I think they will.
Yep.
They will grant for that, and also antisocial behaviour as well, I think.
Yep. The antisocial behaviour rules have not been adjusted in any way. They're still the same. As you say, if you're looking to sell the property and such like, that's all still the same as well. Everything has, the only thing that's been delayed is the actual receiving of the paperwork.
Yeah.
So, and as I explained to landlords, they're like, oh, I can't do anything until March. Trust me, the time your application goes through, you're probably just sitting a couple of weeks short of March before they're probably getting a hearing anyway. So you're actually not losing any time here.
The thing that really worries me is, and there was a line there that said that they've got the powers to extend this till March 2024. And there's absolutely no way that we will be out of this cost of living crisis by March 2023. So that's something to look out for. But we just need to carry on.
Absolutely. Yeah. As I said at the start here, I can only give advice on current legislation. Legislative changes are changing all the time. And it is something for landlords to prepare for and decide whether the future is to retain that property or to dispose of it and such like, and then maybe jump back into the game at a later point when stuff maybe get a bit more stable and such like. Exactly. But certainly, if there is any issues or anybody's unsure, then they can contact me through the website and Facebook pages.
Website and Facebook. Do you want to give a quick mention again, just your company name and your...
Landlord Specialist Services Scotland. That's for the website and for the Facebook page.
Brilliant. We'll put that in the show notes, Jeff, and we really appreciate your time today. You've been really open and helpful with information.
Hopefully people understood what I was saying.
If not, Jeff, they'll still be doing what I would do and still engaging with your services.
That's good.
Thanks again, Jeff.
Thanks very much for your time.
As always, guys, head over to our social media pages. Instagram's probably the best place. Take a screenshot listening to the podcast and tag us. Get over to our events page on our website as well, Stephen.
Yeah, so we've got the events page set up on our website where it's got tickets for the Scottish Property Podcast, Christmas Ball, and also the monthly networking events, which occur the first Wednesday of every month in Glasgow, Edinburgh, Aberdeen, and Dundee.
Thanks again. Speak to you again next week.
Thanks a lot, guys.